Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Imagine a world where, well, your shirt could tell you more about your heart health than maybe even your annual checkup. Sounds a bit like science fiction, doesn't it?
It really does.
But that's the exciting potential coming out of some research at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. You shared some really interesting material on wearable tech, and this deep dive is like zeroed in on this new way to predict heart problems using a smart shirt.
That's right. Today we're looking really closely at a study that investigated whether continuously tracking how quickly your heart rate gets back to normal after you've been active, what's called heart rate recovery.
Right.
Using wearable tech can help us spot people who might be at a higher risk for cardiovascular issues.
So it's like getting a much more detailed, continuous picture of how your heart handles everyday stuff.
Exactly. A much richer picture than just a snapshot in the doctor's office.
Okay. And to really unpack this, we're drawing on a couple of things. There's a health news article giving the overview, but also the original, the dense scientific paper itself.
Published in the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Journal of Health Informatics, yeah. So we've got both the big picture and the nitty-gritty details.
Perfect. So our goal today is really to understand, okay, how does this smart shirt tech actually work? What did the researchers find? Why should we care, for our health? And what could this mean for the future?
And we'll try to do it without getting totally lost in the technical jargon.
Definitely. So let's dive in. What was the core idea behind this whole study?
Well, at its heart, it's built on this established idea. The speed your heart rate slows down after you exert yourself is a really informative sign.
A sign of what exactly?
Of your cardiovascular health, basically how healthy your heart and blood vessels are, and also how well your autonomic nervous system is working.
The autonomic system. That's the one controlling all the background stuff, right? Like breathing, heart rate, things we don't consciously manage.
Precisely. And the thing is, a slower recovery where your heart rate stays high for longer after you stop exercising isn't just a minor blip.
The research links it to some pretty serious issues.
Yeah, definitely. We're talking conditions like heart failure.
Where the heart struggles to pump enough blood.
Right, and coronary artery disease. That's the narrowing of the heart's arteries. Also diabetes mellitus, high blood pressure.
And even in the most severe cases, sudden cardiac death. So it's clearly a significant indicator.
Absolutely vital. But the big challenge, and this is what the study tackles, is that measuring this accurately, it's traditionally been quite involved.
Yeah, the paper mentions needing like a cardiologist visit, a treadmill stress test in a clinic.
Specialized equipment, the whole setup. It's just not something most people can do easily or regularly for monitoring. Makes it pretty inaccessible.
Okay, so that's the problem they were trying to solve. Find a more accessible way.
Exactly. And that's where wearables come in. The researchers wanted to see if they could assess this risk using devices that collect data just during everyday activities.
Much more convenient, potentially catching things earlier.
That's the hope. Gain a broader, more continuous picture of heart health.
So the key tech here was this smart shirt. What exactly is it?
It's a shirt developed by Care Technologies, and the smart part comes from built-in electrocardiogram sensors.
Electrocardiogram, ECG, right? Measuring the heart's electrical activity.
Exactly. So the shirt continuously monitors your heart's rhythm, the strength of the beats, and even something called heart rate variability.
Which is another important heart health marker, looking at the variations between heartbeats.
Yeah, very subtle but significant.
Okay, so who actually wore these shirts for the study?
It was a group of 38 participants, pretty broad age range too, from 20 all the way up to 76 years old.
Men and women.
Yep, a mix of men and women. And interestingly, some already had diagnosed high blood pressure.
And you mentioned the timing. This was during the COVID-19 lockdown in Illinois back in 2021.
It was. And that specific context, people's routines were disrupted, activity levels might have been unusual. That's something the researchers noted could be a factor.
Definitely something to keep in mind. So how did they actually measure the heart rate recovery? Did participants just wear the shirt around the house?
Not just that. To get the specific recovery data, they had participants do a controlled exercise session on a treadmill.
Okay, a proper test.
Yeah, they used a specific protocol, the Naughton test, which gradually ramps up the speed and incline.
To get the heart working.
Right. And then, crucially, there was a monitored recovery period afterward. They also had participants do separate, just comfortable walking trials, more like everyday activity.
Got it. And the shirt was collecting data the whole time.
Constantly. A really rich data set. Things like acceleration, basically tracking body movement in 3 dimensions.
How much they were moving.
Exactly. Overall activity levels, those continuous electrocardiogram signals, the precise timing between each heartbeat, that's the RR interval,
Okay.
even a quality score for those intervals, and of course the heart rate itself. Lots of detail.
Wow. Okay. So with all that data, how did they calculate the actual heart rate recovery number?
They took the highest heart rate reached during that treadmill test, the peak heart rate,
Yeah.
and compared it to the heart rate exactly 1 minute after hitting that peak. The difference between those two numbers was the heart rate recovery value.
Why 1 minute specifically? Not 2 or 5?
Good question. They noted that some participants started moving around again before the 2-minute mark, which could obviously affect the reading. So 1 minute gave them a cleaner measurement post-exercise.
Makes sense. Okay, so they have this recovery number for everyone. How did they then split people into high-risk and low-risk groups?
They looked at the distribution of those recovery numbers across their 38 participants and found the middle value, the median.
And what was that?
It was 28 beats per minute. So if your heart rate dropped by 28 beats or less in that first minute, you were classified as high risk.
And if it dropped by more than 28 beats?
Then you were in the low risk group. They used this median split as a statistical way to distinguish potential risk within their specific group, given the sample size and diversity.
Right, it was data-driven for this particular study population.
Exactly.
Okay, so they have the risk groups based on the treadmill test. But the really cool part, the innovation, was trying to predict that risk without the treadmill test, right? Just using data from the comfortable walking.
Precisely. This is where the machine learning comes in. Could they analyze just the electrocardiogram signals collected by the shirt during those normal walking periods and train a computer model to figure out who belonged in the high-risk recovery group versus the low-risk group?
That's the key question. How did they process that walking data? It must have been, well, messy compared to the controlled test.
It's definitely more variable. They started by breaking down that continuous stream of electrical heart activity into individual segments, using those RR intervals, the time between beats, as the dividers.
Okay, so segmenting beat by beat, essentially.
Sort of, yeah. But because your heart rate changes, those segments weren't all the same length. So to compare them, they used a mathematical technique, linear interpolation, to basically stretch or compress each segment to a standard length.
Like standardizing photos to the same size.
Exactly like that. They standardized each segment to contain 172 data points. Then, for each person, they averaged all these standardized segments from their walking trials together,
Creating one single kind of representative electrical heart signature for each participant based on their normal walking.
You got it. A single feature vector representing their typical walking electrocardiogram pattern.
Okay, but 172 data points per person is still a lot. How did they figure out which of those points were actually important for predicting the risk group?
Yeah, that's a classic machine learning challenge, especially with a small sample size, like 38 people. They use something called feature selection.
To narrow it down.
Right. They actually use 3 different techniques called random forest, lasso, and correlation-based feature selection to identify which parts of that 172-point signature were most strongly linked to heart rate recovery risk.
Using multiple methods for robustness.
Exactly. And the crucial step was they only kept the features, the specific data points that were flagged as important by all 3 methods.
Ah, so only the ones that consistently showed up as predictive across different techniques.
Yep. That really helps focus on the most reliable signals and avoid noise. And guess how many features made the cut?
Out of 172, I don't know, 10, 20?
3.
Wow, only 3 key features from the walking electrocardiogram data seem to hold the most predictive power for heart rate recovery risk in this group.
Incredible, isn't it?
So, did it work? Using just those 3 features, could the machine learning models predict the risk groups?
They could. They tested several standard machine learning classifiers, and one called the support vector classifier performed the best.
How well did it do?
It achieved an accuracy metric, the area under the curve, or AUC, of 86%.
86% accuracy in predicting high versus low heart rate recovery risk, just from comfortable walking data analyzed through this process. That's pretty impressive.
It really is a promising result,
Right.
suggesting this approach has real potential.
And you mentioned something interesting. Earlier age wasn't a strong predictor in this study, which is usually expected, right?
Yeah, typically older age is associated with slower recovery. but here it didn't stand out. The researchers themselves speculated this might be due to that COVID-19 lockdown context.
How so?
Maybe lifestyle changes, stress levels, altered activity patterns during lockdown affected people across different age groups more uniformly than usual, kind of masking the typical age effect. It's a hypothesis.
Fascinating. Okay, let's zoom out. What are the big picture implications here? If this kind of tech pans out, what could it mean for us?
Well, one of the biggest things is accessibility, making heart health monitoring much more widely available.
Right. You mentioned people in rural areas or those who have trouble getting to specialists.
Exactly. A smart shirt or similar wearable could provide continuous or frequent assessments remotely. That's huge.
And potentially catching problems earlier, too.
That's the other major potential benefit. If you're passively collecting this data day in, day out, the system might pick up on subtle negative changes in your heart rate recovery patterns over time.
An early warning system.
Potentially, yeah. Flagging things up that might warrant a closer look from a doctor, maybe before a serious event happens.
And it leads to more personalized insights, maybe.
Yeah.
Like understanding how my heart responds to my daily activities.
Absolutely. Imagine seeing trends based on your own life, your own walks, your own routine, and being able to share that detailed data with your doctor. It shifts towards proactive, personalized care.
It also seems like it broadens the use of heart rate recovery, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's known for predicting mortality risks.
Right. That's well established.
But this study seems to be exploring its use for assessing risk of a wider range of cardiovascular and maybe metabolic issues, too. Not just predicting death, but predicting the risk of developing these conditions.
That's a really important point. Moving beyond just mortality to broader health assessment. Plus, using data from comfortable walking gives a more ecologically valid picture.
Meaning more like real life, not just a lab test.
Exactly. How your heart recovers during your normal day-to-day.
Okay, this all sounds very promising, but we need to be realistic. What were the limitations the researchers pointed out?
Definitely important to cover those. The most obvious one is the sample size.
Just 38 people.
Right. While the results are encouraging within that group, you can't automatically assume it applies perfectly to everyone. We need bigger, more diverse studies to confirm this works more broadly.
And that COVID-19 lockdown context we keep mentioning.
That's another big one. The data was collected during a really unique, unusual time. Activity, stress, everything was different.
So the results, like the age finding, might not hold up in more normal circumstances.
It's possible. We need studies outside of that specific pandemic period.
What about how they define the risk groups, that median split of 28 beats per minute?
Yeah, they acknowledge that defining these high and low risk thresholds is tricky. The 28 BPM cutoff worked for their group, but the optimal threshold might be different for other populations or depending on what specific health outcome you're trying to predict. More research is needed to set clinically validated thresholds.
Okay, and you mentioned the real-world data from walking is a strength, but does it also introduce challenges?
It does. Real life is variable. People walk at different speeds, maybe stop and start, walk on hills or flat ground in different weather.
All things that could affect heart rate, independent of their underlying health.
Exactly. It adds noise and variability that a controlled lab test doesn't have. So while it's realistic, it also makes the analysis potentially trickier.
Any other technical limitations?
Just one subtle one they mentioned regarding data processing, that step where they standardize the length of the electrocardiogram segments using interpolation.
Yeah, resizing them to 172 points.
While necessary for their method, they noted it could potentially introduce some minor distortion to the original heart signal. Future work might explore different ways to handle segments of varying lengths.
Okay, good to keep in mind. Now, the paper also included comments from some of the key researchers involved. What were their perspectives?
Yeah, some interesting quotes. Professor Manuel Hernandez from Biomedical Sciences, he really highlighted how the heart's response to exercise is like an early warning sign for health changes.
That makes sense.
And he stressed the goal is making this tech clinically actionable, something doctors can actually use to help patients.
Right, bridging the gap from research to real-world medicine.
Then there was Professor Richard Sowers, an engineering professor. He painted a picture of the future where data from wearables flows easily to doctors. And he specifically mentioned how beneficial that could be for people with poor access to regular medical care.
Tying back to that accessibility point.
Exactly. And Ais Dogan, the graduate student heavily involved, noted that their algorithm seemed pretty consistent even with the small sample size, which gave them some confidence in the approach.
And collectively, what was the main message from the team?
The big message was the need for more research, larger, more diverse groups, longer follow-up times to see how risk prediction plays out over years,
Right.
and figuring out how to smoothly integrate this into standard healthcare. They also suggested future studies could combine data from exercise and rest periods and specifically dig deeper into how the pandemic affected heart rate recovery.
So lots of exciting potential, but definitely more work needed to fully realize it.
That sums it up well.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How might this kind of wearable technology really change preventative healthcare
Yeah, moving away from just infrequent clinic visits.
towards something more continuous happening right in our homes, on our bodies? What kind of questions does that raise for you, for our listeners?
Big questions about data privacy, for sure. Who sees this constant stream of health data? How is it protected?
And what about our own responsibility? Does this mean we all need to become experts in tracking our heart signals?
It's a shift, definitely. And you wonder what else about our health could benefit from this kind of continuous monitoring down the line.
Yeah, beyond heart rates, sleep, stress, activity patterns,
Yeah.
the possibilities seem vast.
So if this look at smart shirts and heart health got you thinking, we definitely encourage you to explore the wider field of digital health. There's so much happening, so much research into how technology can empower us to understand and manage our own health better.
What other parts of your health do you think could be monitored like this? It's a fascinating question for the future.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.